Hello, listeners. For those of you who've listened to the podcast for a while, you'll know that I have a deep fascination with nautical mysteries. One of the mysteries I have been most interested in over the years is the strange disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers off a remote island in northwest Scotland. In December of 1900, in the Flannan Islands, on Eilean Mor, 3 lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, vanished in stormy weather and without a trace off the remote northwest coast of Scotland. Some of you are probably already familiar with this mystery. It's been popularized in mainstream entertainment. The movie The Vanishing is probably one of the more popular and prominent takes on this mystery. There are a lot of legends surrounding the disappearances, and it's hard to discern fables from fact. Theories range that the men perished due to supernatural forces inhabiting the island since pre-Christian times. Others think maybe a conflict broke out between the men, and they murdered each other in a rage. And finally, another major theory is that some think they were blown over the side of the cliff in a gale or swept away by a giant wave during the raging storm. I was lucky enough to speak with Keith McCloskey, author of The Lighthouse, The Mystery of the Eilean Mor Lighthouse Keepers. Keith's book is a tremendously gripping narrative rooted in his original historical research. Keith has written many books on aviation history and other mysteries, including a book on the Diet-Law of Past Mystery. You can check out his work on his website at keithmccloskey.com. You can also find him on Facebook on his author page as Keith McCloskey, and I've linked to all of his social and his websites in the description. I'm incredibly grateful Keith agreed to come on the podcast and walk me through the unexplained circumstances surrounding the 3 missing lighthouse keepers on Eilean Mor. Here's my conversation with Keith. For today's sake, we're going to talk about the book that I recently read, The Lighthouse, The Mystery of the Eilean Mor Lighthouse Keepers. It's something that I, being a fan of mystery as well, have known about. I think I saw that movie with Gerard Butler a long time ago. Something that's been very popularized. But I was looking for a book because I'm a big reader, and I came across your book, and I got the chance to delve into it a few weeks ago. And I was riveted with it. And I'm curious, like I think you're probably pretty local proximity, geography-wise to that story, but how did you come across it and what made you decide to want to write a book about it?
Well, I used to live in Edinburgh, which is where the headquarters of the National Lighthouse Board was in Scotland, the Northern Lighthouse Board, the NLB. And I had a good friend, and his brother lived actually not far. They lived on Lewis, which is the nearest island to the Flannans. It's the main island of the Hebrides off the northwest coast of Scotland, and they had told me about it many years ago. I don't actually forgotten all about it, but I sort of remembered it when I was reading through a book of various mysteries. It was mentioned in that, and I thought it was that nobody'd really gone into it because there's so many, myths about it, if you like, which we can talk about in a minute. I wanted to get to the bottom of what had actually happened, and so I started looking at it, and I'd been working with a film crew on the Discovery Channel who we'd covered the Dyatlov story, and they were asking if I had any other ideas on mysteries. I told them about this one, and we went up there. It became one of the episodes on the Unexplained files, which appears on time to time on the Discovery Channel, which covered it pretty well, and we actually went out onto Eilean Mor and filmed out there.
That's incredible. And before we get into the mystery of the disappearance of those 3 lighthouse keepers, I kind of wanted to get a sense because, obviously I could tell you're from the area, you know the area, you've seen the area, you've been there. I'm wondering for the listener who's maybe listening who doesn't know that part of Scotland and the UK, like, can you describe the geography of the Flannan Isles and Eilean Mor? Like, what's it like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very remote. It's as remote as you'll get in the British Isles, apart from maybe the Shetland Islands, which are much further north. But the Flannans are off the northwest. They're about 20 miles offshore off the Hebrides up there, and it's the next stop after that is North America. It really is remote, and it's probably the most remote lighthouse that the NLB have up there. They're all automated now, but it was quite I suppose a lot of lighthouses are in bleak areas, if you like, but the Flannans and Eilean Mor are about as remote as you'll get. They're basically 7 very small rocky islands just sticking out of the water. The largest of them is Eilean Mor, and it's about 40 acres. I'm not sure if you use that over there, but there's about 16 acres of grass, which on top of the island, which is the size of a few football pitches, if you like. And the main island sticks out about 280 feet above sea level, so it goes up quite a bit, and it's sheer rock faces. They've had to carve steps out into the rock to be able to get to the top. And the weather is the other thing about it. It's constant, especially in winter. It's constant bad weather. You have the wind sweeping in from the Atlantic, huge waves, and it's constant. I remember a meteorologist said to me that December, January, February up there, it's just storms and nothing else. So you can imagine what it must have been like living there, manning one of these places, just constant bad weather and nothing really to look at other than the rock you were on. Quite a hard life.
Yeah, remote, isolated, like really, really rough terrain to be in, let alone inhabit. So, what was the need for a lighthouse then? Like, why was one needed to be built? When was it built? That sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it was one of the last lighthouses to be built up there, and there's a chain of them around the whole coast. And really in those days they needed. These days you've got GPS and everything's automated, but in those days it was a real danger. Rocks were always a real danger. I mean, they still are now if your equipment goes. But it was one of the last lighthouses to be built in Scotland, and it filled a gap between on that northwest sector. But the other thing about it was basically 7 rocks, and there was no way to warn shipping to avoid them. So it had been suggested in 1853, I think they'd originally suggested putting a lighthouse there, but it was to be another 40 years before they got round to building it. I don't know why, whether there was financial reasons or... The other thing about it, of course, is to build a lighthouse on a rock like that involves having to take all the material out and then haul it up the cliffs, whilst they were building the steps. So it wasn't an easy place to build a lighthouse, but there was definitely a need for it because of the danger to shipping from these 7 rocks. And it was eventually became operational in 7th of December 1899, which was a year before the 3 men disappeared.
Yeah, I was going to say that struck me when I was reading the book, that I couldn't believe how close the disappearance of the men were to the lighthouse being finished. Were those 3 men the original keepers? I can't remember.
Yes, they were.
Right.
Yeah, they were all handpicked for the job. The way it worked was you had a principal. It was a 4-man station, and you had 4 light keepers. There was a principal. He was assisted by 3 what was called ALKs, the assistant light keepers. The principal's word was law, but what happens with a 4-man station is 1 man is always on leave. You do your 28 days and then you go on leave. So it's basically a 3-man station, but with a rotating 4th person who's always on holiday or leave, if you like. And but you'll only have three men on the station. And what had happened there was one man, Joseph Moore, was on leave ashore, and one of the other three keepers was involved in quite a nasty accident there. He'd injured himself quite badly. They had trolleys there, and he lost control of a trolley and had been thrown off it, and injured his shoulder, and he was off sick. So they had to bring in what they call an occasional, which is somebody local who they bring in to act just as an extra help in the place of the person who's sick or away. So it was really two experienced keepers and this occasional who was called Donald MacArthur. And as I say, we'll come on to, there was a bit more to say about this occasional, as he lived locally, but he was a certain type of character, shall we say.
I think that's a good jumping in point to the actual men. You mentioned Donald MacArthur, who's the occasional, probably with what I would say, I don't know if I want to use the word volatile, but maybe difficult temperament out of all the men.
Volatile is how he was described by one of his descendants. He was known to be volatile, if you like. He was a strange character because he'd been in the army, and he'd come up from. He was from that area, but he'd been down south in England with the army, and he'd left the army, and he'd moved back to Lewis, where he was from. But he'd got married, but he was known as a drinker, but at the same time he also did work for the church. As a lot of them probably, it was a very religious area, but. You had two sides to his character, but then a lot of people would drink in these areas anyway. Drinking was almost a national pastime in Scotland anyway. But he had a temper, and it leads on, as I say, when we go into the theories of what may have happened because of it. You weren't allowed alcohol, and there wasn't any alcohol available when you were on duty on these stations, so it's not like he was drinking there.
Let's talk about, I think we should talk about the other two men, Thomas Marshall and James Ducat.
James, he'd had spent all his career in the Lighthouse service, and he had been handpicked by the superintendent for for that position there. His daughter had said that he didn't really want to take it because he was a married man and with 4 children, and they had to stay on the shore station. Some lighthouses, you could have your family living with you at the lighthouse, but because this was on the rocks 20 miles offshore, you couldn't have a family there because, obviously with children needing school, and it just wouldn't have been practical. But he had a lot of experience, James Ducat, and he was handpicked to be the principal there. Thomas Marshall was younger. The principal, Ducat, was probably I think he was in his mid-40s, early to mid-40s. Thomas Marshall was a younger man. He'd only been 3 years in the service, and he was I think he was 29. But he was a large, sort of solid man when you look at his pictures, and apparently quite a placid temperament from what I've heard from his descendants. So the other thing I should mention is, in those days especially, the principal keeper in the lighthouse, his word was law. He decided the jobs that were done. If he said something, that was probably a bit like a small town sheriff, I suppose, with the authority he had. He was not a man to get on the wrong side of, although James Ducat wasn't an unpleasant character, but it was taken that the principal lightkeeper was the man you had to follow his orders or you were out. He even decided what they would eat, on a daily basis. So he ruled the roost, if you like.
And then what about Thomas Marshall? Can you give me a little bit of background on him?
He wasn't married. He was a single man, and he'd only been just a short while in the service. He hadn't been long in it. He had been looking after his father, which was a bone of contention later on, because when he disappeared, there was no compensation paid to his father. His father was 70 and had been a seaman, and he basically, had no income, and he'd relied on Thomas Marshall really to look after him, and relied on his wages, if you like. I mean, it wasn't a phenomenal wage, but it was a steady wage. And the other thing about being a lightkeeper is you didn't have to pay for housing because that was already provided. So he tended to be more of a family man in the sense of looking after his father, but he wasn't married. But he had a very placid temperament, easygoing character, gentle giant, if you like, because he was quite a large, solid build, quite a strong man, but not an unpleasant character particularly.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, it kind of struck me that Marshall and Ducat or Ducat would be probably in this story the protagonists, whereas MacArthur would have been the antagonist. Like that's how I got the impression. Marshall and Ducat were, a bit more virtuous and seemed like guys who were. Like one of them's taking care of his father, the other's got a family, and MacArthur seems a bit more like a hothead. So that's kind of how I interpret it. Is that pretty fair?
Yeah, you've got it in one. Yeah, you've got it in one. I mean, MacArthur had family as well, but he didn't have the temperament of the other two. He was very, volatile is the word. He had a temper as well, which came out with drink and what have you. I don't want to paint him as a entirely bad man, but he was, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have described him as a troublemaker either, but he was somebody who you would be wary of with his temper.
Now, I think I want to set the scene here as we delve into the mystery. When do the men get on the island? Like, when do they start? It's earlier in the year, right?
Yeah, well, the lighthouse became operational on the 7th of December, 1899. And we're talking now the disappearance in December 1900. Almost, it was one year and 1 week and 1 day from the date it became operational. But bearing in mind that it would have been Thomas Marshall and James Ducat who were there from the beginning. MacArthur was only brought in as an occasional in the October. He'd only been with them for two and a half months, basically.
When you were researching and writing the book, did you get a sense of what the men's relationship and what the atmosphere was like leading up to December of 1900? Like, I mean, I know it's tough work to begin with, but, is there a lot of conflict between them? Were you able to discern that through your research? Like, was it pretty mundane? They were just going about doing their business?
You've raised the point, actually. The thing is about people have a romantic view of the life of a lighthouse keeper. Yeah, it might be for some people, but it's just mundane, day-to-day living. You had to get on with the people you were working. I mean, you didn't have to get on with them, but life would become very, very hard if you didn't get on with them, if they irritated you. You can imagine yourself it's not like you finished at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and then you went home to your own house and you lived in a town or a city. You were stuck on this rock, if you like, and and it was the work was the same every day. It was cleaning and getting the light ready to switch on at night, and it was between the three keepers, they would each take a shift of 4 hours throughout the night to maintain the light, and the food wasn't exactly. You would get food delivered once every 4 weeks, and it would have to keep you going. So it's not like there was a fantastic, like on a nuclear submarine, I suppose. Apparently the food's supposed to be quite good, but in these days it was just your basics and long lasting food that would keep. So it wasn't a great life at all. And the other thing about MacArthur, he was an occasional would come on. He would be called to step in and stand in for somebody who was ill, as William Ross was, and he would expect to probably be there just for a couple of weeks, maybe 2, maybe 3 weeks. Whereas, and he had been on there without a break from middle of October right into December. So, and even a normal keeper would have had his leave after 28 days. And here's a guy who's not even getting paid as much as the rest of them and having to do a lot of the skivvy type work. And he's still there after 2 months. And he had to look after his own croft, which needed maintenance, although his wife probably could have done some of it. But, he had his own worries ashore, so you have to see things from his point of view. So I would think, and from what I could read between the lines, is he was probably getting quite annoyed at being stuck there. And when the other keeper, Joseph Moore, returned from leave, it possibly wasn't even to let him go either. So he just had no end in sight until the man he was replacing, who was William Ross, who'd injured himself, came back. So he was looking at possibly another month. So 3 months without a break of any kind probably was starting to push him to the limits.
I want to just set the scene. It's December 1900. The weather is horrible. Like, it's very stormy. That's something that you see throughout the book. Can you give me a bit of context on that? Like, how big of a storm are we talking? Like, it's not just like a 1 or 2 day thing. This thing is raging for quite a while, right?
Well, I got all the weather reports from the Met Office here in the UK. They're down in Exeter, and I've put them all the days leading up to what happened and the days afterwards. I put all what the weather was like every day there, so anybody looking at the book can see it. But yeah, it storms constantly. What happened on the day that they disappeared was in the morning. The weather was. There was showers and blustery wind, and what happened was that was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and from then on, the weather got steadily worse, and it built up until and fairly quickly by 6 o'clock of that day, 6 o'clock in the early evening, it was force 9, which is a strong gale. With waves of up to 32 feet, strong winds, constant rain, really the sort of weather where you wouldn't want to go out in it, which is partly what leads into the mystery, because I've spoken to a number of lighthouse keepers, including 2 who were based on the Flannans. There's very few of these people left now anywhere. And all the lighthouse keepers that I've spoken to, and I had one who was actually a good friend of mine, who I met through aviation history circles, but he told me that when the weather is bad, you stayed in because you're putting yourself at risk, especially on a high rocky island. You can come to grief, especially when the strong winds as well. It's not just the waves, because the winds can blow you off a cliff. And I've said this in virtually every interview I've done, that friend of mine who'd been a lighthouse kid, he spent his whole life on lighthouses up in Scotland. I've mentioned it, like I say, in every interview. He was quite a large man. He was about 6'2", 6'3", and he weighed about 230 pounds, which is 16, nearly 17 stone. He was carrying a fridge between the actual lighthouse and his cottage, and the wind lifted him off his feet. With the fridge, the wind caught. It was a strong, very strong wind that day, and he said it just lifted him and carried him. So, especially out on the Flannans, the wind would have been very strong. So, and again, we're leading on into what actually happened on the day that they disappeared. But just coming back to the weather, the one thing I wanted to say was that day they disappeared, yes, a storm was building. It didn't get to storm force, it got to gale force 9, which is a very strong gale. Big waves, very strong winds. But what happened 2 days later was almost a hurricane, and that is what is reckoned to have caused all the damage on the landing. When the superintendent wrote his report after the disappearance, apparently chunks of earth had been torn out of the top of the cliffs there, and the railings had been pulled out of the concrete, and he admitted that probably happened 2 days after the men disappeared, as it was a storm just below hurricane force.
There's a lot of wind, a lot of rain. What we do know is that for whatever reason, and I know you go through this in the book a little bit, and we don't have to walk through it in too much detail, but I think we need to talk about why at some point the lighthouse keepers leave the lighthouse. They leave the safety and the refuge of the lighthouse. What do we know about that final day and why they had to leave the lighthouse, and what may have happened in that course of events?
The lighthouse was empty when the relief finally arrived. And there's all sorts of myths about what was found when they went in. The first man in there was Joseph Moore, the relief. There was nothing amiss, everything was in its place. They'd had lunch apparently and washed up, and that was all lying on the counter, but there was no knocked over chair. There was the fire had gone out, the clock had stopped. But what they found was that the outside gear of Marshall and Ducat was missing. The oilskins and their sea boots were gone from where they kept them on the rack, and the coat hanger in the kind of hallway before you go out of the lighthouse. But the outside gear of MacArthur was still there, but none of the three men were there. So the conclusions that were drawn was that although MacArthur was missing as well, but he wasn't wearing any outside gear, the other two were. And the strange thing about it is that they put their outside gear on after lunch, and it must have been after 2 o'clock to go out, which again, lighthousemen I spoke to said highly unusual to do that, because the afternoon you did all your chores in the morning, inside or outside, and afternoons were for everybody to rest, ready to switch on the light, because each of them would have to be on duty throughout that night. So, you all three of them would have been resting after lunch in the afternoon, ready to start the night shift. Why they went out, nobody knows. And what makes it stranger is that MacArthur had gone out or disappeared without his outside gear on. It's December, it's cold, it's wet, and high winds, rain. So it's strange. It's not only strange that the other two, Thomas Marshall and James Ducat, went out with their outside gear when they normally would have been asleep, resting for the night shift. But it's strange that MacArthur went out or disappeared without his outside gear. So it's there was no sign of any commotion. The door was closed. There was a gate surrounding a gate and fence that surrounded the station. He closed the gate as well.
Let's get into the theories, though, because there are three kind of main ones. And again, we don't have to go through them in granular detail, because if people want to know all the details, they should read the book. But I do want to brush on them because I think you kind of highlight nicely that there's, I think, well, out of the three, there's probably two theories that hold the most weight, with one of them certainly probably being the one that I lean to. But let's start with, I think, the most sensationalized theories, which, are fun to talk about, but maybe don't hold a lot of truth, and that's the supernatural. Can you tell me about some of the supernatural theories related to the lighthouse keepers going missing?
I don't discount any theory, really. It's the thing about the supernatural is that whole area goes back to pre-Christian times and things happening of, Eilean Mor itself was in pre-Christian times. There was records of people being taken out there for sacrifices for sky gods, and it was also said that the dead from Lewis, the main island there, were taken. The dead were taken out to Eilean Mor and burnt on pyres on top of the island as offerings to the gods. And like I say, this was pre-Christian times. There's ancient records talking of hostile pygmy people in the north of Lewis. The whole area is steeped in that kind of folklore. And I've been to on the main island of Lewis. You've got stones. They're called the Callanish stones, which where ancient rituals were performed in pre-Christian times. And there was this aspect of the main island, Eilean Mor, being a place where the dead were taken to. And when we went out there, I found it's you're standing. Have you ever stood in a graveyard and you get a sense of where you are? To me, it was. I thought Eilean Mor was very much like that. It had a peculiar feel to it. I'm not large enough. I just got a sense of it. And also, there was a small chapel on there, which is still there. A small stone chapel, which is big enough for somebody to crawl in and hide inside it. And that was used by an Irish monk for retreat and prayer. So you had this whole idea of the island being a kind of a sacred place. And one of the theories is that really the lighthouse, all the work on it, the men working there had transgressed the sanctity, sanctity of the island, and that's why they disappeared.
That's terrifying, the way you outline that.
When you're out it's one thing to, you're in the middle of a town, you just think, oh, well, that's supernatural nonsense, but it's something else. You imagine if you're just one of three people out on this remote rock and you can't even see the land that's 20 miles away. It's very isolating, and all sorts of things can happen. I don't discount anything supernatural. I think you have to keep a very open mind on these sort of things. Not in the sense that, say, there's a ghost that might appear or whatever, but I think there are things that are unexplained so far, because we try and explain everything scientifically. But I do think there are some things that haven't been explained yet. And I do keep a very open mind on that.
That's an excellent point about keeping an open mind, because as you were telling me about that, yeah, you were making me think, like, yeah, you shouldn't discount that theory entirely, because we don't actually know what happened.
No, we don't.
Yeah. And that's why we're talking about this. That's why there are multiple different theories.
Yeah.
Another major theory is that there was some sort of foul play or murder involved. I'm curious, can you walk through that theory as well, that there may have been something pretty horrible that happened to these men on that island?
As to the men themselves being murdered by somebody else, it's a possibility, but it's unlikely, because to get there it's difficult. And you must remember that the day they disappeared, the weather was getting worse and worse and worse. It would have been impossible for anybody to have landed on the island, because the waves were 30 feet high. So for anybody wishing them harm, that's not to say that they couldn't have arrived the day before or a couple of days before that and hidden out. Not that there's many places you can hide, and there's no shelter really there either, other than this little stone chapel. But again, that's an unlikely tale. I think, and one of the theory, the people that follow the theory about the murder, is that something happened between the men. And it was, if it did, it was almost certainly Donald MacArthur, because of his volatile temper, because he'd possibly been pushed to the limit of he didn't know how long he was going to be there for, and he was worried about his family and his croft on the mainland, on the main island, and. He also, being an occasional, would have been the dog's body. He would have had to do all the the hard work, and which is what an occasional was taken on for. So it could have been that he just snapped and did away with the other two, and then realising what he'd done, that he would hang for murder of two people at their jobs, important jobs. He probably realised he'd be hanged as well, and just decided to do away with himself. But it's, again, just a theory.
Yeah, and it's like you said, I think if there is any credence to that theory, it would have probably had to have been something that happened amongst the men. Like you said, it would be pretty difficult for an outside ship or boat to think about, and what would be the motive, to try and risk your own life to dock on this remote island to harm these three men. So I think that's a really, really good point that you bring up. The final theory that you bring up, that I wanted to talk about, was the giant wave theory. And I think for those listening who, want to base maybe their theories in a bit more science, this is probably the theory that they'll be drawn to the most. Can you tell me about the giant wave theory?
Well, that's the one, when people say, well, it's obviously a wave, but to me, it isn't necessarily obviously a wave. The things, well, just going on about the wave, yes, there were big waves hitting the western side of the island with the west landing. And the theory is that the three men were all taken by a large wave. But then, sorry, just before I go on to the next step there, there was a gentleman, a lightkeeper, who was based on the Flannans in the 1950s, whose name was Walter Alderbert. And he was the one who came up with the theory. He was looking down at the West Landing, and his view was that a giant wave had taken one of the men, and by one of the men, we're talking Ducat or Marshall, because they had their outside gear on. One of them had gone into the water. The one that was left, who was either Ducat or Marshall, ran back up to the lighthouse, got Thomas Marshall, who was inside, and said, so-and-so's in the water, we've got to help get him out. And that's why MacArthur left his jacket on and ran out, and the two of them went down, and then they too fell in. But the trouble with that is, you've got one giant wave that takes one of them, and then you're expecting another giant wave to come along and take the other two. I can't imagine, with 30-foot waves, that people with the experience of Ducat, who'd spent all his life in the Lighthouse service, and Thomas Marshall, who'd already spent some time as a lighthouse keeper, that they experienced men would have allowed themselves to have got into a position where they would have been taken by a wave or one of them. It just doesn't sound right. But the other thing about it is what they were doing on the West Land. Now, when I went onto the Flannans, we went up the West Landing on the same steps that they would have been on. The part of the talk was that there was a box of ropes that they had to secure, and I've seen the location of that box, and it's 110 feet above sea level. So it would have needed a gigantic wave to have got up to that. Even the 75-foot waves probably would have made it up there, but those 75-foot waves didn't come until 2 days later, where the waves that were there were big enough. But even if there'd been an odd big one, had come up to the 110 feet, grabbed Ducat or Thomas Marshall, dragged him back, and the remaining man had gone and got MacArthur, it would have needed another big wave to have come and taken the two of them. I don't. It's certainly probably, dare I say it, the most plausible theory. But there's a lot of argument against it as well. To me, it doesn't quite ring true.
Thank you for walking me through those theories. What do you think then? Like, you've been there, you've stood on you've stood on Eilean Mor, and you've been there. Like, what goes through your head? Like, what do you think happened, or is it still there is no clear answer or evidence? Like, even after all this time you've spent with the story and being there in person.
I hate to have to say it. To me, the giant wave theory is too easy to explain it. I think something happened to them, but I don't know what. That's the problem. One thing I will say, and I haven't mentioned it before, is it's difficult to try and describe it in words. The actual lighthouse itself is on the very top. It's a funny. It is a giant rock, but it's kind of comes out of the water for 150 feet, and then it slopes upwards to where the actual lighthouse is, and it's at the top of the island, and it's 280 feet above sea level. But one thing I noticed when I was there is if you stand at that lighthouse, you're only about 10 or 15 feet away from literally a nearly 300-foot drop straight down from it. And I was discussing this with my good friend, who's sadly passed now, who was the lighthouse keeper, and he wasn't stationed on the Flannans, but I showed him all the photographs. He wonders if the three of them either had an altercation outside, which went outside, and they were possibly working on a ramp where the steam trolleys were, and it was only just a short few steps to that massive drop on the other side. And of course, if they all went over there, and he said the winds were high as well, there's very high winds, the winds may have caught them and taken all three men over. And that's quite plausible. That is plausible. I wouldn't like, it's difficult to say, because when people say, it's obviously a giant wave, it's not. The other thing I should mention about the giant wave is it was a serious offence for a lighthouse to be left unmanned. So if what Walter Alderbert was saying, although you could say it's a matter of life and death, but for a man to go up and get the other one, leaving the lighthouse unmanned, would have been considered a very serious offence. The superintendent would have probably said that whoever had gone in, the man remaining, should have done his best to get him out, not go and get... Which is what happened, because the lighthouse was unmanned for nearly 2 weeks. The light wasn't on, which was an even greater risk to shipping. So that's another argument against the giant wave. It was a virtual sackable offence to leave a lighthouse unmanned if it had come to light what had happened and they'd survived. The only other serious offence to that was what they called to leave the light standing, which was the failure to maintain the light turning round, so that the ships could see it. If the light wasn't turning, in other words, it was standing, was an instant dismissal. So, and they took those rules quite seriously. So that's another reason that I argue against the giant wave theory, that I doubt MacArthur would have left the lighthouse. There was a lot of bad luck attached to anything to do with what after the men disappeared. Joseph Moore, who was the man, he was the relief keeper, and he was the one who went up to the lighthouse and found them all missing. He said from that day forward, he had never had anything but bad luck. He apparently had relatives die, and close relatives. He just said his life was just one long run of bad luck. The ship that passed the night, on the night of the 15th, when they disappeared, there was a ship past it called the Arch Tor, they saw the light wasn't working that night because they'd all disappeared. That hit a rock. That was on its way to Leith, which is the port for Edinburgh. 48 hours later, after passing that rock, after passing the lighthouse, it hit a rock and just managed to limp into port. And they forgot to, because of what had happened to the ship, it was leaking badly and nearly sank, that they omitted to tell the Northern Lighthouse Board that the lighthouse wasn't working. It was only when it came to light that the men had disappeared that the shipping company then contacted them to say, look, the ship passed by that night and found the light wasn't working. But because it nearly sank, we had our hands full. And then that ship, 12 years later, disappeared without trace. So in the Atlantic somewhere, nobody knows what happened to it. And there was the William Ross, who was MacArthur had replaced. He eventually came back to work after his shoulder had healed. He dropped dead a year later in another lighthouse, and one of the reliefs who took over working, not the relief, but one of the men who replaced one of the missing men, who just, they carried on as normal afterwards. He was killed within 4 years of starting at the lighthouse on the Flannans as well. He fell from the tower. So there was quite a fair bit of bad luck associated with it as well.
If you're interested in reading The Lighthouse, The Mystery of the Eilean Mor Lighthouse Keepers, or any of Keith's other books, please check out the description of the podcast. I want to thank Keith again for coming on the podcast, and I hope he returns in the future. If you enjoyed this episode and want to show appreciation, you can buy me a coffee at the link in the description. If you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, you can head to the Patreon. For $5 a month, you get ad and sponsor-free episodes, exclusive content, and early access to all new episodes of the podcast. If you don't want to spend any money, I totally understand. You can still support the podcast by leaving a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Also, you can find the podcast on social on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks for listening to the Missing and Unexplained podcast.